If everybody wants to start taking their seats, am I on?
Please sit down, we're starting again. I'm going to be... We can't start until people come in and, you know, there's too much noise. Please sit down, everyone. Break over. We're starting. Where's my phone? Oh, yeah, there. You want to give it another 30 seconds and start? Yeah. No, you better start, I think. I'm going to just sit here. Rana is going to moderate this panel. I'm just going to be a presence.
Okay, well, having Cristina on stage in her amazing red dress is going to just get everybody's attention this way.
Please, can people close the door? Or I'll come down and close it myself.
And I'm actually going to get started. So the title of our panel is The Battleground for Global Economic Domination. What's ahead for Europe as the US and China fight for supremacy? And we were really kind of hearing that set up actually quite well by our last panel. We are definitely in a new era. I have some of my favorite people here to talk about it. I'll just introduce very quickly Katherine to my left, who's the former US Trade Rep. Rohit Chopra, the director of the US Financial Consumer Protection Bureau, who is still working for the current administration, although I know he'll still be spicy, and Sander Tordoir, who was on the previous panel, Center for European Reform, and has done a really fantastic study on the German auto industry that everyone must read. And then on Zoom, although I don't see them yet, we have Simon Johnson from MIT, co-author of Power and Progress, amazing book, and Heather Boushey, who is now at the Harvard Kennedy School and was formerly doing industrial policy, green industrial policy for President Biden on his Council of Economic Advisors. Do we see them and can they hear us?
Can we see them?
We can hear you.
Okay, great. Oh, yay. Okay, we see you, Heather. You look great. Okay, and we see you, Simon. Awesome. All right, so I'm gonna, I guess, start with Katherine. I'm gonna ask you, I guess, for some responses to what you've heard so far, but also, I was so struck. I was a huge fan of what the Biden administration in general tried to do with saying, yes, the Bretton Woods system does need to be updated. Yes, it is not purpose-built for our time. We have not done enough to deal with climate, to deal with labor. So let's think about how to do that in a way that we don't end up throwing the baby without the bathwater. And one of the things that you came up with in particular as a prong of this sort of 360 strategy was a post-colonial trade paradigm, which I always liked the idea of. And the notion is that, no, it's not just America alone. It's not just China over here. It has to be a new system that really incentivizes the right things and makes sure, as you said, that there are not ceilings but floors put under the things that we care about. Now, I was surprised, frankly, working for a British publication and dealing in Europe all the time, that it was not just kind of welcomed with open arms, I guess, by Brussels. Some of that, I think, may have been down to communication, but give us your post-game analysis of what you tried to do, what some of the successes were, but also what the challenges and roadblocks were.
Delighted to be here with all of you, and it's I've had to explain to some people why I'm here in Brussels 2 weeks out of my job, and I am so happy to be here. And it's Cristina. Cristina spends a lot of time and puts in a lot of thought to putting these panels together and putting this conference on. And Cristina, this is just my second year being here, but I already see the shift in the conversation. I'm very struck by the fact that the last panel was about how to do industrial policy, not whether to do industrial policy. And that's an enormous shift from 4 or 5 years ago. When Cristina and I talked about this back 6, 7 months ago, I think that you saw the calendar and thought, end of January. It could be a little bit of an uncertain time to have this regular conference. And what I had said to you, and I think others of us said, was you should put it on, and whatever happens, we will be there. If I will be there in my official capacity, if I have one, I will be there in my personal capacity if I don't. So it's because the conversation is that important. So just to start off by saying how happy I am to be here, to be a part of this ongoing conversation. Rana, your question is a profound one in the sense that I have been thinking about it now for quite a long time. And it's why I find myself back here in Brussels, of all places, even 2 weeks out of my job, which is this conversation still relevant? The conversation is ongoing. Is it still relevant for me to be here and for me to be here in Brussels? And the answer is absolutely yes. So we called it a worker-centered trade policy. And the reason why that was important is because it centers trade policy on the experience of the human being in the economy. And not just the human being as a consumer, but also the human being as a producer and as a worker. And the reason why that was so important is because that had been missing in the way that we have been doing trade policy for the last several decades. That was not the original Bretton Woods vision, but it is post-Chicago School, how our multilateral trading system, how this establishment international economic system has evolved, and it needed correction. Now, I think to get to your specific question about why we didn't feel like we had as much pickup from Brussels as we wanted, and we can talk about the legacy. We made a lot of progress, but I think that there's a lot more progress to make, and I think at some point we stopped making that progress in the last 4 years. Just to say that one of the things that I'm so proud of is in our last weeks and last months in office, we did not go gently into that good night. We really continued to push a perspective that we continue to think is relevant. So of the many things that we did in those final months, one is at the beginning of November, my staff, my team and I accomplished something that no other US trade representative had done, which is we marked the 50th US state that we had visited. And the point of making these visits was to connect ourselves in the trade policy conversation with Americans, to meet them where they are. There are a lot of other accomplishments, a set of supply chain papers, supply chain resiliency papers, a set of model negotiating texts, that and a shipbuilding investigation that I know that we'll have the chance to touch on later. But I start with hitting the all 50 American states because the goal for us was to meet Americans, American workers, American farmers, families, consumers, small business owners, where they are in order to understand how we needed to bend trade policy and this international economic elite conversation to make it relevant to the experiences of our fellow Americans and our fellow people in the world. That's the post-colonial piece also. Now, where I think that we had some challenges with Europe and with Brussels in particular is I look back and I think it was very hard for Brussels to meet us in the Biden administration, driving Biden trade policy, to meet us where we were. And I had a conversation last night with a member of the conference who's here that I thought was really quite illuminating, which is she was channeling for me the perspective of Europe on the 4 years ago, the entry of President Biden and his administration into power. And the assumption being that, Biden will come and restore the world and our relationship to the status quo ante. And what's interesting is that there was a lot of restoration. There was a restoration of US engagement with the rest of the world, with rebuilding the transatlantic relationship. But on trade policy in particular, and on his economic policy overall, it was never about going backwards. It was always about taking into account the legacy of the previous 4 years and also the legacy of the previous 4 decades and correcting for what was deficient. And that deficiency was really about connecting a very elite approach to economics and economic policy with the needs of everyone, and in particular the non-elites. And so I think that that is a really useful starting point for the conversation today with new administrations on both sides of the Atlantic around how to navigate the next 4 years and the next 10 years.
That's a really nice frame to put on this. I mean, as you're speaking, I'm remembering that, you know, one of the reasons that we now have Donald Trump Part 2, and the reason that we got Donald Trump Part 1 is that about 8 to 12% of the manufacturing workforce in America was disrupted. That's the same thing in other rich countries. We are about to see, depending on whose analysis you use, 30 to 60% of workers at all levels of the food chain disrupted by technology, by AI, et cetera. And Rohit, in a minute, I'm going to ask you to get into finance and tech and some of that. But this idea of worker-centric trade, of human-centric markets is, I think, very profound and something to come back to. Sandor, I'd love to hear your response to what the ambassador just said, but also, you know, as you were formulating your paper, and feel free to refresh some of the points that I know you made on the last panel, how were you thinking about the lessons of the Biden administration? What folks tried to do with industrial strategy as you are trying to think about what Europe should be doing now as it enters its own China shock?
Thanks so much. Thanks a lot. I would think, at the very least, the Europeans are confronted with the same challenges now much more clearly that I think the Biden administration was trying to address. And so, to some degree, you would have hoped for more of a convergence as the one that the ambassador was trying to engineer, but maybe the Europeans weren't quite there yet in terms of sharing subsidy schemes, thinking through how to essentially steer G7 demand in a way that protects our aggregate manufacturing capacity, which is basically across the board under pressure, also in Japan, also in South Korea, and so on. So I think that's the logic that I'm coming from. I wanted to make 3 analytical points on the transatlantic relationship. The first is that, and I just ended on that note on the last panel, is that European manufacturing is actually not that bad. I think there's way too much fatalism. And there's a kind of fetishization in the European debate about the American model. The idea of, well, let's let go of these mid-tech sectors and we just move to high-tech. The US has that problem too, because its tech sector is mainly design and programming, and it scales wonderfully in terms of profits and revenues, not so much in terms of employment. Consider this: US tech has 6 million employees. 6 million. EU manufacturing has 30 million. So now explain to me the arithmetic of shifting 10 million, 15 million manufacturing jobs into 1.5 million tech jobs, because we already have around 3, 4. So basically, I think the reallocation fairyism is quite dangerous, and the Europeans should watch out with that. And then also, just frankly, I don't believe that cars, advanced civil aviation, advanced chip production, machines, it's not mid-tech, it's very advanced technology. So this distinction, I think, fundamentally is problematic. My second observation is related, which is that in green technology, which was a key priority for the Biden administration, the EU is actually doing pretty well. So if you look at the IMF database on low carbon technologies that are traded, not just solar panels, but the 200 products you need for the green transition, from wind turbines to parts for nuclear energy to parts for building hydroelectric, etc., even building insulation. Europe has the second largest market share in global markets outside the EU. We're not that far behind China. We specialize less in solar panels, obviously, and more in machines. So I think there's a clear case there that the Europeans should take into account. And that leads me to my third observation, which is I think that the rolling back of the Inflation Reduction Act is going to be quite harmful for European manufacturing. The notion that American investment in green tech was going to be at the expense of ours in an elastic, nascent market never made much sense. And it's clearly not borne out by the data. If you look at the low carbon tech trade balance of the US since the IRA was passed, drastically deteriorated. Europe's stayed up pretty well. Essentially, as the US tried to reduce its reliance on Chinese kit, it was pulling in a lot of European clean tech imports. And so rolling back the IRA tax credits for EU-built cars, rolling back wind energy, it will harm European car makers, and it will also harm our wind industry. So I think we should be aware of that.
Okay, great. That's a great point, and I'm going to tease out some more details later on that. Rohit, maybe that's a good moment to come to you, since you are currently working for the Trump administration. I won't say that too strongly or loudly. What's ahead? I mean, we've seen, frankly, it's hard to keep up. It's day 8 or 9. What are you most concerned about in terms of rollbacks? We just heard about the IRA. What are you looking at? And in your job, which is about essentially protecting citizens, what are you concerned about?
Well, let me build a little bit on what Ambassador Tai shared about the framework and the approach, not just that we charted these past few years, but the framework that we rejected. So one of the things that when I came here a few years ago, the conversation was very focused on just a niche part of policy, antitrust, which we all know is extremely important, but often too late. And in reality, it fits into a broader framework of a set of tools that I think has many pillars: trade, I would argue industrial policy, intellectual property, financial services, and competition policy. All of them have, they all talk to each other, and they all end up having an effect on who is the economy actually solving for. And the ambassador talked about President Biden's worker-focused. I think we actually see now some changes across the world about who are we solving for. Are we solving for the corporate royalty, or are we solving for the citizens who are supposed to control governments? Now, Sander mentioned something about technology. I think this is a very important point. If you take a look of market capitalization in each of the major equity market indices across the world, you will find that the ratio between the highest market cap stocks divided by their employees keeps growing and growing and growing. We actually have firms in the US that have 20 or 30 times the number of employees, but are just a tiny percentage of market cap. So this is a fundamental question where I think in some ways the old economic frameworks that were so supreme, we have really turned the page on that. And we're recognizing that we're supposed to be creating something not so that somebody can go into a place and get a cheap toy. That's just one thing. Citizens are workers, they are consumers, they are parents, they're one person. So the way I want us to constantly think about both tech and finance, we want to be tech forward, but we want to make sure our policies support the next technology giant, not just the existing ones. And we also want to judge our economy based on how many new firms are forming. And if you do not have that firm formation, you will have lazy incumbents and you will have slower growth. Now, in financial services, you really, just to get directly to your question, I think there is, and we heard in the last panel, a lot about capital markets union. And, we think a lot about this at home too. When money is placed in a bank or is placed somewhere in the financial system, who is it being transmitted to support growth? I would argue the US financial system does an extremely good job serving very large corporations. There are lots of mechanisms in which they can enjoy cheap sources of financing relative to the rest of the economy, whereas small and mid-sized firms who often need equity capital or very patient debt capital cannot get it. So we have to think, what is even our banking system for in a world of post 0% interest rates? So I think that I am continuing to be skeptical, and I think we did a very good job holding the line on stopping the creep of consolidation, both in financial services and in tech. I think you have more decentralization, which is good, and you need more and more firms in the economy. But Rana, it is not just important about what we did these last few years. What we ended was probably even more important. When I was at the Federal Trade Commission 6 years ago, they were using models that were based on dreams, not reality. They were measuring things that just did not exist in the real world. And we are moving to a more analytical approach that is grounded in values about human beings rather than just supporting incumbents and the royalty.
Such great points. I want to just amplify what you've just said and set up some future questions. This idea of who the financial system is serving is so important. Something that struck me after the financial crisis is that the numbers, which were really bad and extreme, only about 15% of all financial flows in the formal system were actually going into new investment. Most of it was being done in trading, just buying and selling of existing assets, which is bolstering the markets, bolstering housing prices, creating cost of living crisis in some ways, but not actually seeding investment, not actually helping new businesses flourish. Those numbers have not changed, and in fact, concentration has grown, so that's a problem. I want to bookmark and come back to you on where some of the potential crisis points going forward are, because we have an administration that's now actively pressuring the Fed, politicizing the Fed at a time when private debt is at extremely high levels. So there's a lot to talk about there. But let me actually now bring in Heather Boushey on Zoom. And Heather, I want to talk to you. We've already discussed industrial policy a lot. This is something that you have been absolutely in the weeds in for the last 4 years, and you were crucial to coming up with the Inflation Reduction Act. I remember speaking to you for an article I did for Washington Monthly about Bidenomics, and you made a really, really important point that I don't think actually landed in Europe, and I want to help it to land. You said that when you were first starting to work with the administration and asking, how are we going to think about the clean transition? How are we going to incentivize that? You'd been surprised that there wasn't a tax structure yet in place, a carbon trading scheme of the kind that Europe has, and that the answer was actually the president was viewing the climate crisis as a war. And so you throw everything at it. You don't just look at this as a discrete cost problem, a discrete trading problem, a market problem. You look at it as this is a climate war. This is World War II, and we're going to make Detroit build artillery and ships. This is a climate war, and we are going to create a real industrial policy. And I would love it if you could speak a little bit about that evolution.
Yeah, thank you, Rana. And I also want to give a big shout out of thanks to Cristina. This is an incredible conference. I'm so pleased that you're doing it, and sorry I can't be there in person, but this is such an important time for this conversation and continues to be such a priority. So thank you for all of your efforts. It's interesting that you start with the war, because when you started to talk, I was like, wait, what did I tell her? And then also in this context, in this room, I'm sure many people were thinking trade war, but that's not what that conversation was about. It was about the scale and scope of what we have to do to address climate change, the enormous economic transformation that we need to undertake, the enormous amounts of private capital that will take, the new industries that we are all building right now. And that we know that we need to do this as quickly as possible. And we know that we have done things in the past to build up new industries really quickly, and we've done that in times of war. So if we think about this with that sense of urgency, that is part of the background of, I think, how me and many of my colleagues thought about it, although we didn't often use the war metaphor out loud, but it was that sense of urgency. And a couple of other points on that. I mean, first, too often that conversation seemed to be heard in other countries as though it was a zero-sum game. And I think that in this, the reality of climate change and the reality of the energy transition that we need to undertake is that there is an enormous amount of investment that needs to be made all around the world. We are trying to create new clean energy supply chains. There is a lot of places for this to be a win-win, especially over the foreseeable future for most of our lifetimes. And so I know that was a big part of the background for the kinds of conversation that Katherine and her team were having at USTR, how we think about building out a new trade regime to create these new clean energy supply chains. The other motivator for this, the president often talked about how when he heard the word climate, he thought jobs. And I think one of the really interesting threads throughout this conversation so far, very early this morning in my time zone, has been the focus on jobs. And one of my motivations was that 10 years from now, there's not some group of economists at some university in the United States who are writing papers about how we created the kind of shock to the labor market that the China shock created decades ago. I know in this room we're talking about China shock 2.0, and another way to think about that is how are we going to make sure that our communities are reaping the economic benefits of this clean energy transition, not just in terms of the benefits to climate, but the benefits in terms of the new industries that is creating and the new jobs that is creating. And in my full circle back around to the bigger picture here, I want to emphasize that one of the things that this audience is hearing by having Rohit and myself and Katherine from three very different parts of the administration, thinking about trade, thinking about consumer financial protection, the financial sector, me thinking about the economy overall, but really thinking about jobs and the clean industrial strategy, that the guiding principle has been to make sure that this is a worker-oriented approach. And that is the big shift that you can hear that we were all focused on across the administration. And you could see that coming out in the kinds of data that we were producing. So back to your question, or that the economy was producing, back to your question, Rana, if we think about this as a new sector that we need to develop, and we want to use all of the tools of government, we wanted to do so in a way that was making sure that this was empowering workers and benefiting communities all across the country, that we were making these investments in a way where it was crowding in capital to the sectors that matter the most, that were most important and key among those being clean energy, but also tech and semiconductors and others. But that we were really also making sure that we were shaping markets to be fair and competitive, both domestically and internationally. So that really close tie between making sure that we are looking at a global landscape where we can have these industries thrive in a way that creates those jobs at home. And Sander, your data points on high tech versus mid tech, I mean, that really hits home in terms of where we are not creating jobs or creating good jobs across the country. I know Simon has done a lot of work on that as well. But making sure that we're thinking about, as we are standing up these industries, how are we shaping those markets to be fair and competitive? One of the things we did a couple of years ago was the first guidance on how agencies can implement regulations in a way that takes into account market structure and competition. So connecting these dots with that North Star of a worker-focused approach and how is this benefiting workers and communities, that has been the undercurrent of how we have been thinking about it.
That's really helpful. I love that you brought the term market shaping to the fore, because that's something that we heard a lot in the Biden administration. And we also heard from you and from Rohit and others that, we like to, I think a lot of people like to put a binary up of industrial policy or free markets, free trade, I put that in quotation marks, or something that's protectionist. Actually, we're always shaping markets. It just depends on which players you're shaping them for. If you are incentivizing huge amounts of corporate debt and tax cuts, you're incentivizing and shaping markets for certain actors. If you are creating a worker-centered trade strategy, you're shaping it for different actors. So I think that's a super important point, and something that I actually feel, and this is thanks again, Cristina, Ambassador, Rohit, all the folks that are pushing this narrative forward, is finally beginning to show up in, it's been in the FT for a while, but the pages of the New York Times, let's say. Let me bring in Simon Johnson. And Simon, there's many wonderful reasons to have you here. Can you hear us, by the way? See if we can get him up on the screen for you. But
yes,
okay,
I can hear you.
Wonderful, we can hear you. So I take great pleasure in knowing that you, as the most recent Nobel laureate, and that we now have a group of Nobel laureates, yourself, Darren Ajmaolu, Joe Stiglitz, that actually believe in market shaping as a term, don't always think markets know best, and believe that power exists in the political economy. And that seems like a kind of a duh if you're, outside the, the economics profession, but it's not been the way that we've thought about things. So I'd love it if you could just maybe take a moment, kind of reflect on everything that you've heard so far on the panel, and talk about how you and other economists at the forefront of the profession are thinking about power these days, particularly as it relates to this geopolitical struggle we're talking about.
Thanks, Rana. Yes, great points being made by everybody on the panel. And I think I would say three things. First of all, obviously, as you just said, Rana, power is essential to how we think about economics, economic policy, and economic strategy. And we are in the midst of a changing power dynamic between the US and China, which will have major repercussions for Europe. I think has to be the dominant driver of the moment. The second thing I would say is that my colleagues from the Biden administration, I didn't work for the administration, but I have a great deal of admiration for what all three of these wonderful individuals attempted to do and did achieve, and their colleagues as well. It just shows you how hard it is to really move the needle in terms of impact that workers can connect with and workers can believe in. It takes a long time to build these sectors, to deliver on good jobs. It is really hard work, particularly coming from the place that the US was coming from after the first Trump administration, and compounded, of course, by COVID. So that leads to the third point, which I think is the appropriate focus of a lot of your discussion these days, which is Sanders' work and his excellent paper with Brad Setzer. I hope everyone has read or will read. Does China pose a real shock and danger to the European, not just the European economy, but to the way that power is created and managed within Europe? And I find that analysis compelling. I find the facts to be really quite stark. I think if any democracy fails to deliver on good jobs, or for the middle class, whatever terminology you want to use, you've got a major problem coming to that democracy. I think what Mr. Trump is going to do vis-a-vis China, not entirely clear, and there's plenty of rhetoric there, but I think the net effect will be to either push the renminbi to depreciate, that's one effect of the US tariffs if they're actually imposed, but also to divert from US markets to European markets, because they're going to get a lot of friction from what they do in the US markets. So all of this is bringing more pressure to Europe. I don't think it's hopeless. I think there's plenty of things you can do, and Sander and Brad have some very sensible suggestions. It does require a certain degree of organization and, let's call it, strategy at some level. I would add and emphasize the importance of investing in basic science and commercializing those innovations. The US is really good, actually, at putting money into new startups. And, you know, we have ideas coming out of MIT on a daily basis that get funded. We do have a problem, and I think Rohit was alluding to this, in terms of which companies can grow and to what extent can you get big enough to challenge in markets and challenge incumbents. We've allowed too much of the sort of preemptive snapping up of new ideas. And compounding all of this is the obvious point that we have an industrial policy. We've always had industrial policy in the United States, Rana, as you know, and you've written about. The industrial policy at the moment is, as a number of people have alluded, the industrial policy of billionaires, the massive additional, because we already have large subsidies for a lot of rich people, massive additional subsidies for whatever very rich people want to do in two sectors, obviously, the AI-related tech and oil industry, oil and gas. Real estate is also a very powerful elite sector. We'll see what happens in real estate. But those investments, they will, the fiscal power of the United States will be deployed behind those sectors. And that may create opportunities for Europe. Perhaps there's relationships that can be developed and so on. But that is the reality. That will impact China. China will impact Europe if you allow those middle-class jobs to slip away from you, which is what we did in the United States. Then I see no reason why the consequences politically in Europe will be any different from the consequences we are now grappling with in the US. We will grapple with for 4 years, and we will grapple with, I think, for generations to come. Thank you.
Okay, you've brought up the issue of China, you've brought up the issue of tech power. Katherine, I want to come to you and ask you to sort of connect the dots there a little bit. Something that came up in the last 4 years under Biden is that competition policy and trade policy and many other policies were no longer de-siloed, you know, and that's a profound thing. I mean, I believe it was July 2021 where the president laid down his first executive order and said, look, we are not in the business of just making rich people richer and lowering consumer prices. We are in the business of supporting communities, workers, businesses of all sizes, innovators. How, as you were thinking about how to articulate a new trade policy, how did you think about how competition and trade should live together?
So it has been so important to combine these conversations and to bring these communities together, because I think one of the most important things I learned was for our antitrust community, the antitrust policy is about enforcing in the domestic market. And those tools end where your borders are. And the international antitrust is about a conversation between domestic antitrust enforcers. For trade policy really thrives at the border in connecting domestic economies with each other. And the title for this panel has the word domination in it, economic domination, right? And then it poses, you know, what's the path for Europe between the U.S. and China fighting for supremacy? And I think this has come up on the previous panel. Rana, you referenced it earlier as well. We really have to keep breaking through. It's a kind of a silo, these false dichotomies that keep presenting themselves to us in our narratives about ourselves and each other, right? Very, very often, and this is the critical piece of connecting antitrust with trade, very often the conversation becomes, who should be dominant? My giants or your giants? Or US giants or Chinese giants? And at the end of the day, this connection of the conversation and this focus on workers, the human being as a consumer, as a small business owner, has been all about taking on dominance wherever you find it. At the end of the day, it isn't about my giant or yours. It's the fact that these giants control the global economy. And yes, they will have different characteristics and different vocabulary and a different personality depending on where they are organized. But at the end of the day, and this goes back to our good friend Tim Wu, it is all about the curse of bigness wherever you find it, including entire economies that are organized around state capitalism and the state's infusion into economic actors. What we are seeing more and more of, and this is really a signal, I think, to the populists in the current administration. The concern is that this U.S. administration is one where the corporate giants have taken over the government, right? Which is equally a problem of domination. And to Rohit's point, it's that decentralization, right? When we talked about it, it's the democratization of economic opportunity that we really need to find an alliance around. And that is also one of the reasons why this conversation between US policy thinkers and European policy thinkers is so important. We have to find our way to upholding our democracy, our political democracy, but also our economic democracy as well.
Rohit, do you want to jump in on this?
Yeah, it's exactly right. There's a book by Sabeel Rahman, Democracy versus Domination, how they basically can't, it's really one or the other. And one of the things that has been so striking to me is that a lot of the incentives of the largest firms in the planet sometimes seem more aligned with the policy interests of the Chinese Communist Party than they are of America and Europe. And we see this even in the discussions around AI, where I hear regularly, well, you know, we should not really have privacy and data protections because the Chinese surveillance state allows them an advantage to harvest information, and there will be a winner take all, or at least a few winners take all in the race for AI. Now, you know, that puts people in a tough place on tech. It puts people in a tough place when on financial services. When China, we talk about currency manipulation and their own currency, but how are they actually manipulating our currency in order to get certain advantages that are unfair? And so I think what, again, we are trying to center it on is, and Heather mentioned this, fair and competitive, level playing field, that we are trying to match each other on grit and horsepower, not kind of abuse of power and your own dominance. So I really feel that that is always going to want us to figure out how do we create market structures that are much more dispersed, democratized, decentralized, without it being a total Wild West. We want there to be basic rules, and then everyone competes around that. But I do think that Europe needs to really think through how it will position itself when it comes to supporting incumbents and those who are already dominant, or really powering the next group who you may one day want to ascend. Because otherwise, we will lurch into a more Chinese-style economic system. And we do not want that race to the bottom because it is inconsistent with, I think, democratic values.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, you've really raised exactly what's happening at the moment, which is a president that in his speech in Davos said, Europe, don't regulate our big tech giants. We will view that as a tariff. We will view that as a tax. I mean, he is really throwing down the gauntlet. Sandor, do you want to come and weigh in on this? Because I mean, one of the things actually that occurs to me with Trump's alliance with Elon Musk and with some of the big tech giants that were all sitting, and the image of them sitting in the front row at his inauguration was just kind of, ugh. Sorry, a little editorializing there, but I'm a columnist, so I can do that. And it's at the same time, it's interesting to me that with this new $500 billion announcement, Stargate, spooky name, you're already seeing a small, apparently, Chinese company that can come in and make things at half the price. It sort of raises the question of how do you create resilience? How do you create scale? How do you unify supply chains, but still allow enough flexibility in the market for new players to come in and not be squashed or bought or overrun by existing giants? So how do you think Europe should be thinking about that?
Thanks so much. I think one really important intellectual distinction when we talk about industrial policies between picking sectors and being selective, the ones you know that you have a good shot in, and I think Europe has many where we have good shots, and picking or doing handouts to specific firms. You want to make sure there's enough demand in a sector. You want to make sure that there are many players across the European Union, where it can be a strength that we have different countries in one market. And then, let them compete. And you have to do some of the industrial policy to have the level playing field, as you were saying. So that would be my first observation. The second is that there are clear interplays between clean tech manufacturing and resilience in a more military sense. So if you look at batteries, we just had a case a few weeks ago where US drone maker Skydio was basically choked off from batteries from China, and as a result, it couldn't deliver drones to Ukraine and Taiwan. That must clearly be an American and European common concern. And so we will need some battery manufacturing, and in fact, there's a lot of battery plants being built in Europe. Everybody always talks about Northvolt. If you just look at the map, there's a lot happening. So it's not all bad. We're behind, but it's getting there. Another example is permanent magnets in wind turbines. They are a key component of radar systems. So, I think that's an important, not to muddy the waters on the goals, but to be aware of the importance of underlying supply chains and what they mean for various political objectives. My third point more on Trump and his alliance with big tech. I mean, you can read it as a sign of strength. You can also read it as a sign of weakness, in my view, that Zuckerberg and the other CEOs see a need to weaponize the American state to undo European regulation. So I think the Europeans should maybe call the bluff a bit and see how the negotiation goes.
I think that's a great point, actually.
I'm not entirely convinced that we have such a bad hand here, given how important our market still is. And then finally, I do think there should be some potential to work with the Trump administration and the Europeans on the concerns about China. There is a global coalition that's worried about China's distortions. That coalition, when I listen to Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, very much includes him and other members of the Trump administration that want to have a global rebalancing. And so there should be ways of having that conversation, even if there are tensions. And there should also be ways of exerting pressure together on the IMF to pick up on James's points from before and really pressure China to do something on its model. And finally, you can always cut deals, I think. So take Airbus, Boeing. For 20 years, we've been fighting as Europeans and Americans. Now we're concerned that China may, with the same playbook, put a lot of pressure on both companies. Why don't we both just do a bunch of launch aids and not litigate against each other and say, benign neglect, and we keep buying each other's planes, but we move ahead together. I don't think such a deal would be completely off the table, even with the Trump administration, but maybe I'm naive.
Okay, Simon, I want to call you back in, and on this point of alliances of like-minded countries, I mean, we are seeing You could say we're in a bipolar world, a tripolar world, a multipolar world. There's a lot of different alliances being formed. Where do you see the most constructive alliances being formed that could help to fight concentrated power wherever it is, either in the Chinese state or in big tech companies?
Well, you're not going to have the Trump administration in any alliance like that. And the Chinese obviously have got other priorities. Look, I think that building on some points Sandra was making, that you need to think about what the Americans are going to do and the way that the opportunities that creates for Europe, and then think about whether you want to take those on. So energy, for example, obviously lowering the cost of energy is an important goal. The Americans are going to go in the other direction with the electricity-intensive AI push. Mr. Trump's best idea is to drill for a lot more oil and gas. The US is already very close to capacity, and it's hard to expand that. If Europe could really move the needle on energy usage, energy efficiency, as well as on generation, that changes the global picture dramatically. If you can drive down and have the potential and of course, forward-looking commitment to drive down the price of oil and gas, irrespective of what happens on the demand side of the global economy, that changes everything, including American power, including what happens in the Middle East, including Mr. Putin. Now, what that would say is you need a big push and alliance within Europe, I think, Rana, and an agreement, as Sandra was saying, that you pick some sectors, you agree on shared development costs, you also agree on competition, you don't necessarily know which country and which particular firm is going to win, right? So that is a very difficult, well, not trivial conversation within Europe. But I think there are some sectors, that's the most obvious. And the US is going to retreat from green energy, which is a massive strategic mistake, I would say, in terms of good jobs. Just thinking about good jobs as well. I mean, the climate is, of course, very important, but just on the good jobs piece. So Europe has some places where they can invest. And I think bigger investments in science and commercializing and make it easier to create new ventures in Europe is a huge priority. But that's been a priority for about 40 years, and nobody's been able to move on that. So
let me actually,
I think that's where we are.
I'll amplify and add to your thought about energy alliances. I mean, one thing we're already seeing literally last week, first week of the administration, blue states fighting back. You're seeing California, which cut a lot of its own climate regulatory deals with companies under the first Trump administration, saying, you know what, we're filing suit. We're not, we're not going to deal with this. You're seeing certain blue states coming together and seeing if there are ways to actually create demand incentives to do things differently. Don't know if this is going to work, but just adding those possibilities and players to the table. Heather, let me bring you in on this, since clean energy was your focus and you're an expert. Do you agree with what Simon said around potential alliances in energy, what Europe could be doing around energy, and what else should and can Europe, US, the rest of the world be doing to fight back against concentrated power wherever it comes from right now?
Big questions. On the energy front, I mean, certainly Simon is right, and the Trump administration has already taken serious steps to say that they're going to pare back. A couple of things I will note. We put out this 75-page report on our way out the door in the Biden administration that goes through just how much we did, and over 90% of the IRA funds that could be awarded, that have been awarded, and so I think it's important to note that there is so much support out there in the United States for these clean energy technologies. Katherine got to 50 states. I only made it to 19, but in most of them, I was visiting new manufacturing facilities that were engaged in some of these clean energy technologies. And those factories are being built. Those workers presumably will be hired. The Trump administration is trying to pare back, perhaps the actual disbursement of the funds for these awards and the chaos that the administration is creating. But there's going to be pushback from that private sector. And as you said, blue states are already working on that, and of course the injunction, but all of that. So I think that there will continue to be those sectors in the United States that have that support already. Now, whether or not they can continue is going to be a big question, but I think that will continue to be a role. But I also agree with both Simon and Sandra has been saying all along that there is enormous opportunity for Europe in the absence of our leadership to continue to build out and to create those jobs in their own economies. I want to take just an economist privilege here of focusing on something a little bit wonky that Rohit mentioned in his first remarks about the FTC using models based on dreams. And one of the concrete things that we need to do to move forward is to really think about how our economic toolkit is not been grounded, has too often not been grounded, to use Rohit's words, in an analytic approach grounded in human beings. And we've been hearing a lot about trade-offs and whether or not we are accurately assessing the trade-offs. But this conversation, I think, has created some real marching orders for those folks that are working on models and thinking about how we think about economic trade-offs, that we have to think about power and democracy and what it means for human systems and communities, not just perhaps things that might be a lot easier to measure. And I think that is a place where there was a lot of work over the past few years internationally, and I think will continue. And again, that's very wonky, but if you can change the conversation among finance ministers, among central bankers about how you are integrating the actual benefits and costs of the clean energy transition, the actual benefits and costs of climate change in a way that accounts for what it means for humans, for their communities as the outcome metric, I think we could actually make a lot of progress in this kind of conversation moving forward. So just a bit of a call to action there that I've been hearing in the conversation. One other thing while I have the mic just for a second, I really want to double down on Sanders' point about the really core distinction between industrial policy that is picking winners and losers and is picking sectors, which gets back to your point, Rana. We picked sectors. We picked energy and 38 different parts of the clean energy industries. And because we did this primarily through tax credits, it will be harder for the Trump administration to undo, but all bets are off. I think that does create a sense of strength and source, a source of strength for those sectors moving forward. But I just want to double down that I think that's really interesting, and I hope we can continue to learn from. I certainly will be spending the next few years. What can we learn from the way that we did it here in the United States? What lessons are there for us and for folks around the world? So I just wanted to plus one your comments, Sandra. And your piece was fantastic.
Those are great points and teeing up well maybe the next round of questions. I'm going to actually ask everybody, particularly those that have worked in the U.S. administration, just what lessons would you say, look, we got this right, we should double down? What would you say we still need work in this area? And what would you say, failed, was challenged in a way that we should take note of? Katherine, why don't you start?
Sure. I think that in the space of 4 years, we have pushed through trade to be a change agent. That's why this conversation is so exciting and feels so fulfilling. I know that outside of this room, there's still a lot of resistance to change. So this is a little bit of an artificial sense of progress. This progress is necessary to larger progress. And I think that's how I think about the 4 years that I spent as U.S. trade representative. We made a lot of progress, but we have not finished the job. The focus was to flip the script on trickle-down economics because it has failed to deliver. And at this point, the evidence should be clear to everyone. It's not yet, but that was a large part of our push, is to open people's eyes and to say, there is another way of doing this, right? We called it middle out, bottom up economics. Every single one of us represented here had our piece of it. That was the unifying vision. When I talked about not going gently into that good night, and the work product that we pushed out at USTR in the final weeks of our time, I really want to take an opportunity to highlight what we put out there, because that is the culmination of 4 years worth of articulating a vision, and then also trying to produce the tools for engaging the rest of the world, our trading partners, especially the European Union. And so the supply chain papers, it's a set of 6 papers focused around the theme of supply chain resiliency that are really making the economic case, but also the trade policy case and articulating trade policy tools, including the role of tariffs and rules of origin in crafting a more resilient trading system, more resilient trading rules around sector-specific approaches, trade rules and trade agreements that could support cooperative, coordinated industrial policies. Those are out there. May not be for a very general audience, although a couple of those papers are. There are kernels in there for the trade wonks amongst us.
Actually, before I let you go, I want to drill down on the shipbuilding case that you mentioned, which I think is one of these areas where we could see some interesting alliances, even under this administration. So I guess it was about a year and a half ago, a case was brought by various U.S. unions that China's mercantilist policies in shipbuilding had undermined the industry in such a way that it was both an economic concern and a national security concern. Just to throw out a couple of numbers, the U.S., I think, has a little over 100 ocean-going vessels today. China has 5,500. The supply and logistics and military implications of that are huge. Reading the case, it was almost like an arc of the last 20 or 30 years of some of the fallacies of the neoliberal system, some of the fallacies that the market would just always correct for the best outcome. We've already seen the Biden administration sign up a deal to make new ships, icebreakers actually, with Finns and Canadians. We see a bipartisan Ships Act coming down the pike. I've heard from European companies in Italy and Scandinavia that they would love to work with the U.S. on some of these new supply chains. Is that a potential area, you think, for alliances?
Yes, absolutely. It was 9 months ago, so time is, very elastic, and it feels like a long time. It was 9 months ago. The investigation runs a full year. We took our 9 months to produce a report. For those of you who have the tolerance for lengthy reports, especially those of you in the antitrust community, I would just have you take a look at, maybe start with the executive summary, the shipbuilding investigation report, our latest report, and by our I mean the United States, report on China's WTO compliance, to look at not just the supply chain resiliency papers, but also the set of 5 model negotiating texts. And if you know that one of the most important breakthroughs that we've made is to de-silo, to break down the silo between trade and antitrust, you will see that theme, that arc of the convergence of those two conversations in every single one of those work products. But yes, the task before the Trump administration will be to pick up that investigation where we left it off. The report and the findings are the first step. Where we have found economic harm to the United States shipbuilding sector, including the services around it that wrap around it, it is up to the Trump administration in the next 3 months to articulate what the remedies will be and who will have a role in remedying this loss of capacity and this creation of dominance in the PRC. And that I think, in my gut, requires a role not just for the executive branch, but for the U.S. Congress and for our trading partners.
Interesting. You're kind of laying down the gauntlet for the new administration on that. Rohit, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, you asked about reflections of things you might wish you have understood, got ahead of. I think that as we went through the process of more restrictive monetary policy, you did not necessarily see some of the changes in pricing that the textbooks and the central bankers around the world would have expected. And in many ways, this cycle exposed some of the limitations of our models. And I'll give the example of pricing of certain staple goods that really surged. And there was not really a demand explanation for it.
Commodities? Or?
Well, I mean, look at diapers, for example. We had huge increases in the price of diapers without a baby boom. And there was no evidence that there was more diaper usage for other parts of the economy. And when you saw that kind of spike, and including laundry detergent, and you start reflecting on it, and it was not necessarily that, there was fiscal stimulus and everyone was running to buy diapers. It was that there was a weaponization of certain power through different stages of the distribution channel that even could potentially be traced even to freight rail transportation, ports, retailers, distributors, as well as much more sophisticated surveillance-based pricing models that don't really allow us to measure the way prices should work in a way that they used to be able to. So I think as central banks are thinking about the distribution of monetary policy, as a financial regulator that focuses on mortgages, credit cards, other things, there was evidence that more restrictive monetary policy was causing prices to go up in housing because people could not access mortgage credit and construction financing, and therefore there were not more homes being built. And that created an issue with housing affordability. So the models that we have been using, I think what's really exciting is you have a new set of thinking in the economics profession that is tossing out all of this stuff. And it's so important for us to say that model didn't work and the predictions were wrong.
Yes.
And putting that on the record so that we have the courage to learn and not use the same broken model again. So I think that is something I reflect a lot about, and I really take a look. I look a lot at transaction, what people are purchasing, what's coming out of their monthly budget. And if you really look what was sapping a lot of it, it was some of the core things like housing, credit card and mortgage interest, which, by the way, does not show up in a consumer price index. So we got to rethink some of this, and I'm glad that competition and antitrust have more of a seat at the table now to be thinking about how monetary policy transmission works.
Talk about de-siloing, absolutely. A lot more work to be done on that. Sandor, you were nodding a lot of these points. If you want to jump in.
Oh, yeah. No, maybe to add a wonky point, which fits well, I think there's also an interesting, not my field, but an interesting new field that's looking more at consumer price baskets based on regions, based on income distributions and how they differ. And I think it speaks to your point about there's a lot of knowledge, in a way, of inflation dynamics that we don't have yet, and that's coming. And I think that's a good segue to make one other point I wanted to make. Because I'm really humbled by everybody appreciating the paper that I did, but I didn't do it alone. I did it with an American colleague, Brad Setzer, who's been mentioned a bit. And it fits with the wonky comment because I think one of the things that Brad has done really pioneering work in is showing just how large China's trade surplus now is. He started this campaign a couple of years ago where he basically didn't quite trust the official data coming out of China and going into the IMF current account data, etc. And he really did that work. So I think just wanted to give a shout out to him for that.
Lies and statistics. Okay, I hate to do this, but Cristina is telling me we need to bring in Adam Tooze. Yeah?
Yes.
So,
do we have Adam on the line? And I don't want to hold him too long in the waiting room. I can see he's coming on. Hi Adam, we can see you while we. I want to bring you in at this point because I believe you've been listening to part of this conversation. But let me say before I do that, I found this panel absolutely exciting and elating. I mean, this is why I do this. I find it profoundly moving that this is the people in this row and online are my favorite people. And the way in which I've been trying to just bring to Europe this conversation is something that I care passionately about, because the way that the dots are being joined by this set of people is unique and profound. So I really will defer the round of applause to them. I'm frustrated that Europe is so resilient to this message. We still are not joining the dots. We are hearing it. Antitrust, finance, trade, industrial policy. Let's kind of get it together. And we still hear, well, no, it's nothing to do with us. Trade talk to the hand. It's what they do over there. And it is unbelievably maddening, because it is obvious that this is where we need to go. Okay, let me stop my peroration at this point. I want to bring in Adam Tooze. Adam, thank you so much for joining, Professor of Columbia. I believe you've been listening to a little bit of the discussion. I want to give you free rein to just really comment on some of what you heard. You and I had a discussion before this day, and many of the things you said were profound and resonated with me. Is this a moment? When I said to you, Europe is facing a new reality, you corrected me and said, no, not really. I think this is not something new. Europe has been asleep and we should have seen it coming. Other points that you made, I let you develop that, but please give us your view on this set of issues. Thank you.
I hope you can hear me okay.
Yes, we can. We can.
Excellent. Well, it's a pleasure to be here and fascinating to listen to my colleagues speaking about the American experience so eloquently. I must say I have a somewhat different reaction to you. Because yes, when you said, is Europe in a new situation, I did push back on that, because I think the Zeitenwende, Olaf Scholz's phrase, though it was important for German politics to register that something had happened, was very belated. It's quite clear, I think, that the fundamental breaks, both in Europe's political economy and those of the wider world, began in the 2010s. And furthermore, the other thing I think that's misleading about that idea is that it implies a kind of black and white shift. We were in one reality, then we were another, and then it's a matter of kind of finding our bearings. Whereas what we're experiencing is more like an avalanche, a flood, or a mudslide. In other words, it's accumulating, it's widening, and it's becoming more radical all the time. And one of the things you can say about American politics and American political economy, unlike that in Europe, is at the very least, the American political system stage by stage reflects this. And the folks that you have on your panel this morning were part of that process of progressive unhinging of the previous order. Of course, they have a very positive spin on what they were doing. But there's no question that the relationship of both the Trump one administration and the Biden administration, for instance, towards institutions like the WTO, compounded a process of unhinging. They say so very openly, right? This is their project of changing the parameters, changing the outlines, changing the discourse. And this is something you see about American politics. Unlike in Europe, it owns its own radicalism. The first version of Trump was very much the American carnage model, right? It was a profoundly pessimistic, extremely dark version. The single thing to say about the Biden administration in the end, unfortunately, is that in its central political objective, which was to prevent Trump 2, having had the good fortune, in inverted commas, though Democratic Party strategists are quite open about this, that COVID unhinged what was otherwise a high probability of a second Trump administration. The fundamental reality about everything you've just heard is that though this is a strategy which sounds great, it failed in its absolutely central mission, which was to prevent a second Trump administration. And I say this with some degree of feeling because I don't know what the reality of my colleagues is there in Europe right now, but if you've been in an institution in the United States in this last week, which was heavily dependent on public funding, your reality is not a calm reality, right? I mean, I'm in an extremely privileged position, I'll be fine. But our university is being profoundly disrupted by the consequences of the failure of the Biden administration to deliver a victory. Now, we all know incumbents all took a beating in that last year, and the Biden administration suffered a less severe beating. But the choice is, the reality that we're facing now is an extremely serious one. And I think if the case for the Biden administration was that it was able to rally working class Americans, blue collar Americans around the Biden administration, the evidence goes against that. In other words, whatever this strategy's intentions were, it didn't work, right? In terms of class polarization, the electoral outcome in last year was every bit as polarized, and the moving apart of the American electorate into a group which is dominated on the one hand by college-educated folks like ourselves, and on the other hand, blue-collar Americans with less education is more extreme than it was in previous elections. This is not something you can blame the Biden administration for. It's a long-running trend, but this well-intentioned strategy did not, in its most fundamental outline, succeed. And the result is that as of this week, if you are in an institution like mine, the question is our future more like Erdogan? Is our future more like Orban? Or is our future more like Meloni in terms of the impact of this political disaster on the functioning of an institution, even one as well endowed and as richly endowed as Colombia, which is facing shots from all sides on immigration policy, on funding, the possibility of coercive McCarthy-style inquiries into whatever the agenda is set, whatever the tactical agenda is set in Congress, right? So that's the reality in, and I'm making this dramatic because that is also the reality that is coming Europe's way, right? Because Trump 2.0 still does gather votes from resentful left behind people, but one shouldn't confuse the mood of 2024, 2025 with that of 2016, 2017, right? The predominant tone is one of triumphalism. The predominant tone is of American exceptionalism weaponized and raised to a new level. And this is a story about oil that's been mentioned, about American energy dominance. It's a story about tech. But more generally, I think it's a story about a more and more assertive American nationalism. The single common denominator is not workers now, but American workers, by which we mean a highly narrowly defined definition of what the American population is, and the immigration policy is going to bite, and it's going to bite hard at all levels in American society over the coming weeks, months, and years. And that is the reality that Europe needs to be prepared for. It's an ongoing part of this process, which goes back almost 10 years now, but it's accelerating and it's radicalizing into a world which is more dangerous than the last time round. That world was already not calm, but it's a world which is more dangerous. And it's in part dangerous, of course, because of the escalation of external threats. China's been referred to a lot so far, Russia hardly at all, but there they are. But it's also in part a world that's more dangerous and chaotic because of the United States, right? So this is Europe's fundamental dilemma, which is that the stabilizing anchor of Europe's understanding of the world, and I say this with some feeling, being a product of West Germany in the 1970s and 1980s, that has gone. And it's gone to an extent that we don't yet understand, I think, and are going to find out. So that's my kind of, this is the historian's kind of take, but also somebody who at this point can't deny that we have a stake right here, right now. All of this week is taken up at my institution with trying to figure out whether we can run a global university with liberal principles under the existing circumstances in the United States, and how far, for instance, threats against billions of dollars of science funding will be weaponized against the critical studies in humanities and social sciences, which will be taken as a target by folks in Congress. So those are the kind of dilemmas which we currently face, and I think it's useful perhaps just to put that in the room for Europeans as to the kind of linkages that you're going to see. And it was mentioned earlier on, you regulate our big tech firms, we'll come after you on tariffs. That kind of disinhibited, fungible use of power is what we're up against, and it's bare knuckles. It's not going to be polite the way we were used to for the Biden administration. It's not going to be pedagogic almost, like here's the new mantra, you should understand this. It's going to be really between the eyes.
And Adam, that's, I think, very sobering and an important casting of the predicament we're in. Shift to Europe a bit more, and give us a view. Much of this morning, too early for you, has been occupied by talking about Europeans' predicament, Germany, the developments even just yesterday in Germany, where the biggest party has been voting, not voting together with the right. This has discombobulated many. Even this morning, coming to this conference, was very apprehension about what's happening over there. But that's on the political side. But you talk about the impact, of course, of the new administration in the US. It's not going to be polite over here. How do you see the dynamic playing out in Germany and as a result in Europe in the next couple of years? And we don't know what the result of the election are going to be, and that, of course, is going to be determinative. But focus on Germany and Europe for a bit.
I mean, I think, again, we have to strike a balance between, the well-known, achingly familiar structural issues, capital markets union, banking union, these kind of things which Europe has been talking about literally for, 15 years, okay? People like Sander are deep in the trenches here, and it takes what the Germans would call Sitzfleisch, seating meat, to stay with these conversations because they're so slow. And then I think on the other hand, we also have to take seriously the deterioration, right? The progressive worsening of the conditions of these conversations, and the state of German democracy is one of those. Not just the state of democracy, but there's a real analog here to the Biden administration experience. Though I doubt you'll get people from the Ample coalition to look back so fondly on their period as government as we've heard from our American friends here. But that was, to my estimation, the most progressive government in the world at the moment that it was inaugurated in 2021. It had a clear agenda for change, and it's been a failure, right? So these policies, of course, we learn from them, as has been emphasized amply this morning, and there's all sorts of wonkish lessons we can take away, but failing at politics has consequences, and failing at politics in the way the Ample coalition has is disastrous. I think you could say the same thing about the Macron experiment. We all remember what a relief it was when Macron was elected, and there was this sense that populism might not be this unstoppable avalanche. But there have been a series of real profound political miscalculations. You could start with Gilets jaunes and the way in which the entire conversation about carbon taxing has been influenced ever since by the cack-handed combination of highly inegalitarian tax cuts with a necessary increase in carbon pricing, because that's actually a key element of a rational climate policy, which Europe understands and America struggles with this idea because it's impossible in the United States, not because people don't get it, but because it's just never going to work. So Europe's problems are a mixture of structural issues and compounding political failure. And we should recognize, I think, the low ebb, the low state we've reached when somebody like Meloni appears to be really the highest functioning political actor in the European system at this moment. You can make an exception maybe for the Spanish Social Democrats, who have at least clung on to power, but otherwise it's a race between those two. And Paris and Germany are in terrible mess. If we break this down more analytically and less in terms of the political dynamics, I think the questions are the old questions, or rather relatively, they're not deeply old, but they're the combination of macro policy on the one hand and industrial policy on the other. And the attention grabbing thing, and in part because of the influence of our friends in the Biden administration, is the industrial policy side. But they know perfectly well that what actually propelled the rapid growth in the United States is the open-handed macro policy, which was a huge success. And conversely, in Europe, nothing will go unless the macro policy side is fixed. And, in terms of bad European news, literally just hours ago, we got the GDP numbers for 2024, and whoopsie-daisy, France and Germany have gone into actual GDP decline in the last quarter of last year. So the macro news just gets worse and worse, and we all know what the logjams there are, notably on the German side, and the absurdly constrained conversation that's taking place about fiscal. On the industrial policy side, I'm actually a little bit with Sander on this. I actually think that the focus on industrial policy, the neoliberals had a point. One of the reasons why it's a bad idea in their terms to talk about industrial policy is you have to orientate yourself in that space and do so sensibly. And it's hard to do. It's not just hard to pick winners. It's hard to tell which are the winners and which are the losers and what sectors matter. It's incredibly difficult to do it in a concerted way that doesn't lead you into the sorts of mood swings which Sandhu, I think, was really nicely calling out for us. Another way of putting this would be, and this is the lesson the Biden economics people have really learned, is you really need to know much more about the economy than you did before. And I think we're still, and a lot of that knowledge is contingent on expectations about the future and guesses about which technologies matter. So whereas it's very clear what's wrong with Europe on the macro side, I think the estimation of the problems on the industrial policy side is much harder to do. And I quite like Sandhu's pushback on the alarmism, say, of the Draghi report. But to bend this back, it seems to me extremely unlikely, and this is, after all, one of the points that Draghi was making, it's extremely unlikely that whatever industrial policy you might want to pursue, for better or worse, hit or miss, it's very unlikely that that's going to work at any kind of scale unless you can address the fiscal side, unless you can address the macro, and ultimately the deep political questions of whether Europe actually wants to have a sovereign central actor. Because if it did, we all know what it would need. It would need to double down on the 2020 experiment with common bond issuance, and it could easily do that. And even if interest rates have gone up, as Chopra pointed out, we still are in a space where Europe could easily issue the scale of funding that would be necessary. And we all know what the political objections to that are. And Friedrich Merz has been very clear, right? He launched his campaign in part with letter, because that's a market coherent model of Europe, and denounced the Draghi report essentially on its key issue, which is common bond issuance. And so I know that EU insiders will say it's not all about finance twos and like the macro stuff, but looking at the difference between the US and the EU, how can you come away with any other impression that if you continue to run a low pressure economy, the overall effects are likely to be far less positive than what we've seen in the Biden team, which is a hit and miss industrial policy and a gigantic macro push. And the combination of those two things, I disagree, has been very, very impressive in every respect other than ensuring the key political victory.
This is a great way of ending in some way. Open ovation, applause from the room. I think maybe, Sandra, I wanted to give you the opportunity to just jump in and make a final sort of point with Adam. Adam is rightly saying it's a lot about the macro and then industrial policy, if you can get it right. Godspeed. And his challenge, which was also one that came up from the panel this morning, is how do we trust anyone in an administration to really get the selection that you talk about? We need to be selective about sectors. We need to be getting it right. How do we trust this group of people to get it right? And I think this goes directly to your recommendation, which is we ought to really do this, but in a selective way. How do we get it right? You want to engage with with Adam on this?
I mean, there was so much there. It was very rich. Thank you, Adam. I would say I basically fully agree with Adam's point on the macro side. And we know that it's been very difficult always for Europe because we have a monetary union. We have relatively constraining fiscal rules. Germany has a batshit crazy fiscal rule that allows it to do no fiscal, basically. So, we have a complicated system. And I agree the macro side is a key part of it. And I was making the case before that also for industrial policy, you need demand. And if you don't have demand, it's not going to work. And that brings in Adam's point, so I completely agree. And European bond issuance is entirely feasible. We know how to do it. If the politics is there, it should be no issue to go for 500 billion in common bonds for European defense and strategic industries. It takes a couple of weeks. You've set it up, and then you can issue for a couple of years. But there's no will. Where I think I'm struggling more, where I have profound intellectual anxiety myself, is how the Biden project failed on the terms that Adam was describing in its central political goal. So even if you get all these things roughly right, you still get crushed at the polls. And I have not definitively for myself figured out what I think about that.
Is there any comment?
In fairness, you could say they didn't get crushed, right? Of all the incumbents last year, they did relatively least badly. And so you could, and I've made this case, because I'm a strong defender of the Biden administration's macro policy. The argument from Larry Summers and those kind of folks that they overdid it in 2021, I think is totally specious and unsupported. The situation just could be loaded against you, and the willingness of the other side to play two themes of nationalism and xenophobia may just simply, and on the other hand, profound class resentments against folks like us, against the professional managerial class, right? Ultimately, I think we underestimate, and I was very struck by Ambassador Tai's comment about having able to visit 50 states. It's like you went to the people to discover the United States, in your phrase, where they were. That though it's an answer, and it's clearly a good faith effort to narrow that gap, it reflects a profound gulf that in the end is, I think, under the thing which couldn't easily be overcome and which Trump so skillfully plays to, even from his own position of extreme privilege, this sense of the elite and the people. It's profoundly, and he gives them a marginal majority. It's not like they won some huge landslide, but in this crucial election, that's all they need, because now they have power.
Katherine, do you want to just...
Yes, I feel the need to say something.
That's only fair.
Which is this? Let me put it this way. There's a very moving story, and I believe the story's origin is Irish. And you really have to hear Martin Sheen, our great American actor, tell the story. So he does it. It's on YouTube. Take a look. But I'll do my best rendition, which is a man dies and he goes to heaven. And he's at the pearly gates, and he's greeted by St. Peter. And St. Peter looks at him and says, "Did you live a good life?" And he said, "Yes, I believe I was a good person. I tried to do the right thing." And St. Peter said, "Great. Now roll up your sleeves." And the man's confused, and he says, "Well, okay. Why?" So he rolls up his sleeves, and St. Peter leans over and looks at him and says, "Well, but where are your scars?" And the man says, well, I don't have any. And St. Peter says, "Well, was there nothing worth fighting for?" So, Adam, I think, my response to you on your point of political failure is this. I don't want anybody to leave this room thinking that they have no role in what happened or what's going to happen. Where are your scars, Adam? I can show you mine. And I can tell you where Rohit's ours. It was not fun being Biden's U.S. trade representative, and I can tell you about the beatings that I have taken here in Brussels and across Europe. Where was Europe these past 4 years? Our futures are bound together, fortunately or unfortunately. The future is not yet written. And yes, these next years are going to be extremely painful. The last 8 days, we're on the 9th day, are just the beginning. But I think that the most important part of this conference and this conversation is for everyone here to understand that they have agency and that they are a part of the problem we are facing now, and therefore each and every one of us is also a part of any solution that there may be in the future.
Wow. Great. I think that on this note, I am going to thank Adam Tooze very much for his contribution, which is always wonderful to hear. And I'm going to thank this panel for everything. I'll stop here or I'll get cried.